The Bush family were pioneers. They were one of the first families in the early 1800s to leave the safety of the East Coast, relative safety of the East Coast, and cross the Mississippi River and head west to settle on the American frontier. Of course, at this time, there was very little settlement that had occurred on the frontier. And it was still a very wild place, dangerous place. There were many Native American or Indian tribes that were still on the prairie, on the frontier, and there were wild animals, and there was just a whole lot of stuff that could go bad for these pioneers that went west. It made it a very dangerous journey. Well, our story opens with his family having traveled miles past the last settlement. Many miles past the last settlement. It's a large family, an extended family, 12 to 15 members. They have with them 4 wagons, horses, and some cattle. Everything that they need, and quite honestly, everything that they own, everything that they have with them because, well, they were heading west to settle out west. They weren't planning on going back to the east. Well, they stop for the night and they circle up the wagons and for some sense of fortitude. And, well, I guess actually it wouldn't be they square up the wagons because there were 4. So can't hardly make a circle out of 4. But anyway, you get the idea. They get the wagons so there's an enclosure, and after supper they go to sleep. Some on the ground in the middle of all the wagons, some in the actual wagons, but they all go to sleep, with the exception of the oldest 2 boys, who are really young men. They're both in their early 20s. These 2 young men have a job to do. Their job is to keep watch. Their job is to stay awake and alert. And so that the family doesn't get attacked by any of the Indian or Native American tribes that are in the area, wild animal, or any other reason. That they're to stay alert. They're to keep watch so that bad things don't happen to the family. They're to protect the family. One boy sits on one side of the camp and the other on the other side of the camp, and they are to keep watch for danger of any sort. But they're not very trustworthy. In fact, they're both very lazy, and quickly both of the 2 sentries are asleep. As the story goes, that night a band of Sioux Indians came upon their camp. And one of the Indians slips up to one of the boys as he is sleeping. And the story says that he got so close that he was literally face to face with the boy. And the boy just kept sleeping away. The Sioux grabbed his knife and was about to kill the boy when he had a change of heart, a change of mind. He put his knife back away, and he went and got his companions. And essentially what they did was they took the horses and the cattle and anything else that was of value from the family. They stole from the family anything that had any value whatsoever. Everyone in the family lives, but they lose everything. All their horses, their cattle. So the family is left afoot, miles from the nearest settlement, miles from any help. They are stranded on the prairie, and it happened because the boys did not keep watch. They fell asleep when it was their turn to be awake and alert. And because they failed to keep watch, their family suffered tremendous loss. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what could that story possibly have to do with a Bible lesson? That's a fair question. And the truth is, it illustrates a very important Bible teaching. A teaching that applies to our lives as a whole, and especially for our purposes today, to our prayer life. And that teaching is watchfulness. On many occasions, the Bible tells us to be watchful. It teaches us to be watchful in our lives, and specifically, it teaches us to be watchful in our prayer life. Now, last time that we were here, we talked about the first of the biblical principles for powerful prayer, and that is righteousness. According to James 5:16, if you want to pray powerful and effective prayers, you must be living a righteous life. Now, righteousness is the foundation for a powerful prayer life. Now, but there are additional principles as well. And a couple of these can be seen in Colossians chapter 4, verse 2. If you want to open up your Bibles to Colossians 4, verse 2, we'll be reading from there shortly. If we are to pray powerfully, then not only must we be living a righteous life, but we must also understand these principles as well. In Colossians 4, verse 2, Paul tells us, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. Now, actually, there are three principles for powerful prayer in this verse: devotion, watchfulness, and thanksgiving. But given the time that we have this morning, we're going to focus on devotion and watchfulness. We'll leave Thanksgiving for the fourth Thursday in November. No, I'm just kidding. We always need to be thankful, okay? That's a very important principle for powerful prayer. But first, let's pick up with the theme of devotion. And in a moment, we'll talk about watchfulness. So for now, we're going to leave the Bush family stranded out on the prairie, miles from help, miles from the last settlement, in deep trouble. We're going to come back to that scene in just a few moments, but for now, let's think a little bit about devotion. If we're going to look at a word, it helps us if we have a definition of the word. If we want to understand the word, we need to know what the word means. Well, when we're talking about words that come from the Bible, a lot of times it does good to know what the English word says, but it maybe is a little bit even better if we go back and we see what the word was in the original language. In the New Testament, in the New Testament, that would be in the Greek language. If you look up this word in a Greek lexicon or dictionary, it is defined as to adhere to, persist in, be busily engaged in, or to busy oneself with. This means two things. First of all, a considerable, or at least a significant amount of time is spent doing whatever it is that we are devoted to. So you might say that there is a time element that is involved in devotion. You spend a lot of time, or as much time as you possibly can, doing that which you are devoted to. But there's also a commitment element involved, a commitment about doing that particular activity, a persistence, something you don't like to let other things interfere with it. Now, speaking in that regard, Monica will tell you that I am devoted to soccer. I love to watch soccer on television. I spent several years refereeing youth soccer. That's a trip and a half. If you've never tried to referee or umpire any youth sport, you need to do it at least once just to find out how ignorant some parents are. Anyway, and I also refereed high school soccer for a number of years, and I enjoyed that, and I really did, and I like to watch soccer on television. Several years ago, my dad, who's here this morning, and my mom also, but anyway, that's how it's supposed to work, Charlie, right? It's Charlie's grandson. Wanda, a little bit, yeah, okay. All right, great-grandson, I should say. Anyway, where was I? When my dad was one of the elders of a congregation, they supported a missionary in Brazil. And they needed to send one of the elders to check on that missionary and observe his work and things of that nature. And somehow my dad got to go to Brazil. And when he told me he was going to Brazil, the first thing I said after, "Can you put me in your suitcase?" The first thing I said was, "Bring me back a soccer jersey." And he did. And all because I'm devoted to soccer. If the U.S. can't win the World Cup, I'd like to see Brazil win it, okay? So when you're devoted to something, you don't like to let things interfere with it. Not only Monica, but I'm sure that my daughters could tell you, if I'm watching a soccer game on TV, I don't like there to be a lot of external noise, no matter how important it is, okay? If the house is on fire, maybe, okay? But see, the point is, I'm devoted to it. I don't like to let things interfere with it. Based on that definition, I am a devoted fan of soccer. Now, for some of you, that may be football. You're a devoted fan of football, or basketball, or baseball, or that might be that way for you. Or maybe it's not necessarily a sport. Maybe it's a sporting team in one of the major professional sports, or in the college sports, or what have you. And in your opinion, that team has never, ever lost a game. They may have come up short on the scoreboard, but it's because the other team cheated or the referees were biased. But they never lost on their own merits, because they just couldn't do that, because you're a devoted fan of that team. Based on this definition of devotion, do we have any devoted fans of prayer here? Do we have anyone here who likes to spend significant time in prayer? Who sets time aside each day to pray? And you don't like to let other things interfere with the time that you've set aside to pray? Are you persistent in your prayer life? Is it a priority in your life? Or do you pray when you think about it if you have the time? Do we have any devoted fans of prayer here? Now that's sort of tough to understand. So let's see if we can get a definition of the concept of devotion in prayer. And to do this, I think we need to look at the early church. The early church prayed powerfully. One reason is because they prayed with devotion. Acts chapter 1 verse 14 is a good place to start. Acts 1:14 says, "They all joined together constantly in prayer." These are the early disciples of Jesus, a group numbering about 120. And they were in the upper room, and they were joined together constantly in prayer. Now that word constantly, as the NIV translates it, is actually the same word as appears in Colossians 4:2. That is translated as devoted, or devote yourselves to prayer. So the early church joined together devotedly in prayer. They were devoted to it. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, we have another instance. It says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer." This is the church after the day of Pentecost, after the 3,000 were added to their number. They were devoted to four things. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching. In other words, they spent significant time listening to the apostles. They were devoted to the fellowship. Hey, if there was a chance to get together, they got together. They were devoted to the breaking of bread, to remembering Christ's sacrifice, spending time together, perhaps eating in a meal. And they were devoted to prayer. They were persistent in it. If there was an opportunity to do it, they did it. They were committed to it. When they had that opportunity, they took it. It didn't matter what else they had going on. If somebody said, hey, let's get together up over at so-and-so's house and pray, then they were there. That's how devoted they were to all of these things. Then there's Acts chapter 6. The apostles tell the early church that they need some help. And why do they need help? Well, the Grecian widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. We understand that. But the disciples need help in leadership for the church. And so they get everybody together, and verse 4 tells us we need to appoint some people to take care of this so that we can give our attention to prayer and ministry of the Word. That give our attention to, that's the idea of being devoted to. Now, these were some good things. I mean, taking care of these widows was a good thing. There was nothing wrong with it. But it would have been wrong for the apostles to neglect these other things, ministry of the Word and prayer, to wait on tables. And so the first deacons or the prototype for the office of deacon is brought into existence. But the bottom line, they didn't want other things, good things, to interfere with their prayer time. So what we might say is, simple equation, time plus commitment equals devotion and equals powerful prayer. How powerful of prayer? If you look at Acts chapter 4, verse 31, the apostles have been threatened with persecution. They go back to the church. They tell the church about it. The church prays. And Acts 4:31 tells us that when they finished praying, the place where they were meeting was shaken. Friends, that's powerful prayer. That's what it means to be devoted to prayer. Now, I see the look in some of your eyes. I do. What you're thinking is, if that's what it takes to pray powerful prayers, then I'm just going to have to settle for weak prayers. I just don't have the time or the energy. My schedule is so packed with all these other things that are going on, good things that are important. And then, not only is it my schedule, but then I got my kids' schedule that I have to fit into it. They've got to be at this practice and that practice and the other practice, and then home to eat, and then they got homework to do, and I don't have time. I guess I'm just destined for a life of weak prayer. If that's what you're thinking, I want to tell you a story about a lady. She's a single mom, holding down 2 jobs, 2 kids. But she was mighty in prayer. Despite having those 2 jobs and despite having the 2 kids, she hardly ever missed a church service. And she was mighty in prayer. How did she do it? Well, somebody asked her one time, how do you do it? How do you pray so effectively? And essentially what she said was, I take every opportunity to pray. And she says, let me explain what that means. When I'm in the car by myself, I don't turn on the radio. I use that time to pray. When when there's some downtime at one of my jobs and I'm just sitting there idly in front of a computer or whatever, I don't log in and check Facebook. I pray. When I'm at home doing chores, doing the dishes, I pray. In fact, she says she carried on sort of a running conversation with God all day long. And at night, she said she usually would go to sleep while praying. And I don't know, that struck me as odd when I first heard it. And maybe not necessarily, maybe flat out wrong. I mean, to go to sleep while you're praying? That just seemed like it would be insulting to God. But then I had a child myself. And one day, she crawled up in my arm and started telling me about what she had done that day. And she yawned. I shouldn't do that, should I? She yawned, went on with more of her story, and yawned again. Pretty soon she was asleep. And I want to tell you something. There is no greater joy for a father than to have their child crawl up into their lap and go to sleep. And that has to be what God feels like when we go to sleep, when we're praying. Is that, hey, we're just so relaxed and so comfortable, and His arms make us feel so secure that we can drift off into blissful slumber. Bottom line, it was just part of her life. It was just part of her life, and she prayed powerfully. We can be devoted to prayer, but we have to make the commitment. And that's really what it boils down to, isn't it? I mean, it's the same with anything that you are devoted to. I mentioned to you about refereeing soccer. On a couple of occasions, I refereed with some people who refereed at the next level, we might say. They were refereeing college soccer. And they were apparently impressed with the way that I called the games that I was working with them. And they said, you need to get your NCAA certification. And I said, really? Why do I need that? Oh, it's a great thing. I mean, you get done with your job on Friday, and Friday night you fly to somewhere, these nice college campuses everywhere. They put you up in a nice hotel, and on Saturday afternoon or evening you have your game, and then you spend Saturday night there, and then Sunday afternoon, they fly you home. It's just great. And I'm kind of like, I don't know that the elders would think that that's such a great plan for me. I'm sorry, I can't be there. I have to go referee a soccer game. But you don't understand. It's an NCAA school. No. I wasn't going to be that devoted to soccer. I had another guy that I refereed with, and he actually lived 6 months of the year in Europe and refereed games for not the English Premier League that you see on TV on Saturday morning, but one of the third tier levels or something of that nature. And he said, it's great. I'm like, for you, okay, it's great, but that wouldn't be good for me. I've got a wife and family here that would kind of like me to be around 6 months out of the year, and then the other 6 months too. So anyway, but I just wasn't, I made a choice not to be that devoted, not to be that dedicated to my soccer refereeing. And the same is true with prayer. If we'll make the choice, that's what it boils down to. It's a choice that we make. What are we going to be devoted to? We need to willingly make the commitment to turn off the radio or to turn off our phones, as the case may be. But what if somebody needs me? Hey, if somebody needs you, when you turn your phone back on, you're going to get their message. And you can tell them, hey, I had to turn my phone off because I wanted to be 100% focused on what I was doing. We have to tune out the world and tune in to our hearts and minds to communion with God. That's all it takes. And it doesn't matter what your schedule is either. You can be devoted to prayer, but it means less devotion to the things of the world. Let me share with you two additional scriptures. Ephesians 6:18, Paul says, always keep on praying. Always keep on praying. 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray continually. Pray without ceasing. If I, or if you, are to pray powerful prayers, we must live a righteous life, and we must be devoted in our prayers. But all that, we must also be watchful in our prayers. Now, there again, we're looking at a word. It helps if we know what the word means. This word comes, in the Greek, it comes from a scene like we described at the start of the sermon. A family, maybe a group of soldiers even, are out at night, in a hostile area. Danger is all around them. While the others sleep, someone must be alert. Someone must not sleep. They must be focused on potential danger. They must be ready for the possibility of attack. In a word, they must be watchful. Now, the Bible applies the word watchful to the Christian life on a number of occasions. We're to be watchful against Satan. We're to be watchful for the second coming of Christ. Those sort of make sense to us, don't they? They make sense to us because we can understand them. But on at least 4 occasions, the term watchful is used in association with prayer. And you know, that stumped me for the longest time. How is watchful descriptive of how one would pray? That's why we need to look past the word and again look at the concept. And the definition of the concept of watchful in prayer is Jesus. Specifically on the night that he was betrayed. In Matthew chapter 26, if you want to turn in your Bibles to Matthew 26, verses 38 through 41. We talked about this passage a few weeks ago. Jesus is in Gethsemane before he goes to the cross. He has taken his 11 now disciples, remember Judas had left, to the gates of the Garden of Gethsemane. Then he takes Peter, James, and John with him into the garden. And as he does, well, let's pick up in verse 38. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Jesus doesn't ask them to watch on his behalf. He doesn't say, "I want you to be the lookout for when that band of soldiers led by Judas shows up." He wants them to watch as he watched. Jesus goes a little further by himself and he prays. And he prays with a fervor and with an intensity and an earnestness that is unmatched by a mere human being. He prays one of the most focused, one of the most powerful prayers ever prayed. Evidently, it lasted for an hour. Excuse me. Verse 40 tells us. So what does it mean to be watchful in prayer? I believe what it means is to take prayer to a level of intensity and alertness and focus and fervency that is beyond what typically passes for prayer or casual prayer. What this means is, it may mean that we go without sleep on occasion so that we can pray. Or we go without food, which is what fasting is about. Not about waiting for your blood test in the morning. Fasting is about giving up food, spending considerable time focused in on prayer when the burdens are great. It means to be alert, to shut out other distractions so that there can be focus and intensity and direction in our prayers. Jesus gives us the example. He kept watch while he prayed. That's what it means to be watchful in prayer. When we are watchful in prayer, we take prayer to a level that is beyond what is casually considered prayer. Now, don't misunderstand me. Casual prayer is important, and it's a good starting point, and we need to be engaged in it if we can't do any more. But watchfulness takes prayer to a height and an intensity that I'm not sure occurs. I could be wrong. I hope I am. There are some other examples, though, of the concept. Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Very early in the morning, when it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. This is the day following the Sabbath. So it's a Sunday. He had been healing the day before. Actually, at sunset, people started bringing him people to heal because it was the Sabbath. And he had been healing into the night. And yet he gets up early. And when he gets up early, he probably could have stayed in the house. It was still dark. Nobody else was awake probably, but he doesn't. He goes off by himself. This was a time when he needed to focus, to get away from everyone and pray. So here's an example of Jesus giving up sleep to pray. Why? If you look at verse 45 of Mark chapter 1, so many people were coming to Jesus that he had to hide. A couple chapters later, Mark 6, verse 46. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. He had just fed the 5,000. Okay? He had sent the disciples ahead of him across the lake in a boat. He dismissed the crowd and went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Why would he do that? Well, John chapter 6, verse 15 tells us that he knew the crowds had intended to come and make him king by force. I mean, if you can feed 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves of bread and two small fish, hey, you got my vote for emperor. And people were going to force him to become king. Luke 5:16 tells us, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. He prayed often in lonely places, places where he would not be disturbed, places where he could focus and pray with intensity. That's hard to do today. And one of the reasons it's so hard to do today is because we've got those silly cell phone things with us all the time. All the time. And if it rings, we got to answer it. Being an important talk with somebody else face to face. And if your phone rings, excuse me, I need to answer this. We need to understand that if we're going to pray powerfully, we need to eliminate the distractions from us. Actually, these verses demonstrate not only watchfulness, but also devotion, because these two principles overlap each other. While devotion has to do much with the quantity of prayer, watchfulness in prayer has to do with the quality of prayer. Jesus was both watchful and devoted as he prayed. If you or I would pray powerfully, then we must pray from a righteous life, James 5:16. And we must pray with devotion and watchfulness, Colossians 4, verse 2. God is so good. He has promised that if we would pray, He would answer. But we don't ask all that often. And when we do, we don't ask with much fervor or intensity. We reserve our most intense prayers for times of crisis. But so much is lost because we are not alert and because we are not watchful, because we sleep like the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. So much is lost because we don't take every opportunity to pray devotedly and watchfully. God calls us to be watchful, and not just in our prayers, but also in our lives. And God is the perfect example of watchfulness. Let me share with you one more passage. Psalm 121, verses 1 through 8 says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is at your side, at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. His care is never ending, and He is never distracted. He is the great and compassionate God that calls us to serve, and that we serve. And He calls you to Him today. Maybe you've realized that you've not been praying powerfully and effective prayers because you haven't been living a righteous life. Or maybe you haven't been praying powerful and effective prayers because you haven't been praying with much devotion or with much watchfulness. If so, I urge you to start. I urge you to start to try to live that righteous life that He calls you to. I urge you to pray with devotion and watchfulness. And see if your prayers don't increase exponentially in their power. Maybe you need help to do that. We want to help. We want to help you if you haven't been living a righteous life to start living a righteous life. We want to help you if you haven't been praying with devotion and watchfulness to pray that you will. Begin to pray with devotion and watchfulness. And we will, if you let us know you need that help, by coming to the front now as we stand and sing.